You aren't really forced to develop the economic system the way it is. There was an IMF report some years back that said in mining, the most resource-rich countries in Africa are at equal terms with the less, but with regard to oil, the more oil you have, the worse it is. Because basically then the most profitable thing in the economy becomes the rent seeking and not to make the system work, right? So if you're a politician, if you only have agriculture, like in some countries, you need to get the whole economy to work in order to prosper, in order to generate economic profit. If you have oil, it's just better to try to steal oil and you're fine. And that becomes the focus of the economy. So that's a part of it. It's not as bad as in Angola. Because in Angola you have to import egg and milk and everything because there's absolutely nothing that works. In Nigeria, at least there's some basics that work. Then I think this is one of the reasons for my apologies. I think Nigerians just love big plans. And if you're Nigerians in the room, I think you can confirm it. So big plans. So instead of fixing one airport, the plan says we should build 30 airports, right? Instead of having one airline that actually works, I think it's the last country in the world that doesn't have a national airline. Yes. The guy said, let's have 3 airlines, right? Yeah. Instead of saying that they want to upgrade the police, so every police force in Nigeria should have a helicopter. So let's buy whatever 1,000 helicopters. But of course, instead they have 16 of those 16. 3 are used to transport VIPs. There are 5 that works, and the rest are in the maintenance yard, right? Like constantly. So big plans is the part of the reason for the despair of Nigeria. Right? And of course, even had to shut down the airport in Abuja for 6 weeks because there were basically 2 big potholes. So the South Africa airline flight just couldn't land because it had been raining. And of course, there are master plans. Nigerians love master plans, right? So there's a renewable energy master plan, there's a gas master plan, there's a power master plan, there's a transmission master plan. So it's the country with the most master plans in the world. And all are made by, sorry to say, by IMF and the World Bank and its institutions. So if they go out, they see a problem and say, let's make a master plan, and it just goes on. So, and despite all this master plan, it's really horrible. I can land in Lagos in the morning, and I get to a city with 20 million inhabitants. But there's a power outage most often when I get there. So basically, you can't see the city. So imagine you land in New York and you can't see that the city is there. And then those people have bonfires, and then you see people running around in the dark. And then you say, oh, so maybe I'm in Lagos, right? There's all these people running around with the bonfire. So it's like, sorry to again, it's like Mad Max movie, right?
You're just saying the reality. Just go on and search in the reality. You're just saying the reality. Go on.
That's it, yeah. It's a Mad Max kind of world, right? After the last collapse, you go to Nigeria, you land there, 5 o'clock in the morning. I have the privilege of having one car ahead of me and one behind, blah, blah, blah. And, but I drive into the city and I think, well, maybe it's Lagos, I don't know. And then if you look at the facts, so the electricity production is 1/5 of Norway, right? So basically,
1/10.
Yeah, 1/10. Yeah, maybe
actual production is 1/10.
Yeah, okay. So the capacity is 1/5, and then production is 1/10. Yeah, that makes sense. The power outage in Norway, you can't even. There's not even statistics for the frequency of power outages because it doesn't happen, right? In Nigeria, there's statistics 2.8 times per month. The power will go down if you have a manufacturing plant, which basically means you cannot have a manufacturing plant because the power will go down and everything will break and your whole production revenue will get destroyed. But of course, what we have is the master plans, right? And then of course, I need to talk about corruption because it's a plague. When I was there, the head of one of the company I worked with, he was making his farewell speech, and then he said, he asked me to read his speech, and I said, you cannot say what you're planning to say. And I said, well, it's my last day, I'm just going to say it. And then he went up on the podium and he said, Nigeria is the most corrupt country in the world. And all the Nigerians were cheering. Half of the guys were cheering because finally this guy said the things the way they were. Yeah. And the other half was sharing because they were actually world champions in something. So they were actually, and there was a problem with corruption. They actually disagree with you. It's not, the problem is not the money that's stolen. So, and every day a crude carrier, like supertanker, as we say in Norwegian, of crude disappears.
Yes.
So if you compare production to export, it's like one crude carrier. And because you go, I was running around in Lagos, and people you can buy, because the refinery doesn't work. So what people they pour the oil through the loaf of bread, and then you get gasoline in the other part, and then people run around in the street and sell gasoline, right? Because extremely dangerous, non-functioning, but it's like, yeah. But again, oil is stolen, but that's not the problem. If people only had stolen the money and said, like, I'm a super minister, every month, just put it on the website, every month I will steal $5 million. It would be fine. That's not the problem. Because the problem is that, because you can't steal oil, the only way they can steal is that they they introduce investment projects that only have one objective, which is basically to put out a lot of contracts in the market, so that the guy who issues the contract can get the kickbacks or the provisions. Right? So you don't have to spend $100 million in investments to generate corruption that gives you $5 million back. So if you are to steal, you better just steal. Right? Instead of having it's the most ineffective robbery business in the world. Because you basically, so as a consequence, Nigeria is the country in Africa with the highest investment ratio. So basically, if you look at statistics, you invest more than any other country. Yeah. But of course, with the lowest capital efficiency. Because the whole purpose with the project is to steal. And you get a 20x factor between what you gain in the robbery and what the cost of the country. So as I said, just steal the money and just stop killing. And my best example there is you build a national stadium in Abuja for the African Games. And then, of course, the first weekend the whole thing blew down and collapsed. And then in Nigeria, they said in the Nigerian newspaper, they said, well, because they built it on the site of the thunder god. So who would it back? Because the reality was that they built the whole stadium without any steel beams. Because the guy who was controlling the inspectors, he was, of course, bribed. So, surprise, surprise, and then because someone had just spent $200 million on building something that just broke down. So this needs to be addressed, and just tell your politicians, just steal that money, and just get over with it, and then, but when you do a project, do it with the objective that actually should deliver. So that's my advice. Then, of course, I'll get to a bit more positive message, because I think the corruption occurs, you say it's between the classes, it's between the communities. I think it's largely because whatever constituency you're part of, if you are from a village, if you are from a tribe, whatever, it's legitimate. And it's actually expected for you that you will steal a bit because you need to pay your friends or your family or your tribes. And it's almost, the government has been taken hostage by people at the more decentralized level. So the solution for me is actually to move power down on the more distributed level, at the village level or community level or whatever. Which takes me to one example. Because if you look at the fixed lines telephone, like with the copper lines, as some of us recall from the past, of course that's a systemic thing, right? To make that work, you need infrastructure and you need systems and investments, and you need to ensure no one steals the copper, right? And that it's actually copper in the line and not something else. In Norway, we got 800,000 fixed line phones, 800,000. In Nigeria, a country whatever 100 times as big, there were 150,000 at peak. So we had 5 times as many in Norway as in Nigeria, fixed line mobile phone, fixed line phone connections. Because of this was a system that required a joint investment, joint action, whatever. Right? What now, of course, has happened is that you have the mobile phone revolution. So in Norway, even though we are only 5 million inhabitants, we have 5.7 million mobile phones. It's like everyone has it. In Nigeria, there's 144 million. So basically, when you could move this from like a systemic thing to a community level thing, and of course at every mobile installation you need a guard so no one steals it, but that's doable, right? And you have this enormous penetration of technology, which of course then also leads everyone having an address, and then everyone actually needing a bit of dollars to pay for it. And by the way, you actually create a transparent formal economy that you can tax. So this small thing, it's sort of almost a hope for Africa, hope for Nigeria, because you formalize a much larger part of the economy, which then can turn into a lot of other technology revolutions we see now. In the past, of course, building this big coal-fired or gas-fired power plant never worked, right? But 10 years from now, power will be distributed, right? You will have a solar plant, power plant in every village. You can have a windmill in some locations. So the challenge of Nigeria can turn from a kind of a systemic thing back to the community level, which I think can then trigger growth and trigger the perspective. And then based on that, you can also distribute technology. So you can have distributed banking, you can have distributed manufacturing, because you actually now will get power that works. So I think to sum up, I think that my expectation, I will even say it's my expectation and my hope for Nigeria is that the enablement of technology and the economic system reduces the importance of this layer of government and of whatever of the nation that doesn't work down to the level that works well, which is the level which is depending on the entrepreneurship, the capabilities, and the willingness to put in an extra effort of the Nigerian people. So that's my positive message in the end. So thanks for that.
Good.
Okay, so I'll try to speak without the mic as well. Hope you can hear me. I think I'll start with just giving three little snapshots. I mean, first of all, confession time. I've never been to Nigeria. So it's hard to speak with these guys, and of course even more with all the experts in the audience here, as Jens Petter pointed out. I don't think I was invited to take part in this because of my detailed knowledge of Nigeria. I think there were probably some other reasons, and I'll try to do justice to the honor of being here. Three snapshots, so kind of at the superficial level, but nevertheless, I remember very well reading Chinua Achebe's book, Things Falling Apart, and I was thinking about that title when Sven Harald was making his presentation. It seems that a lot of things are still falling apart, at least when it comes to what's not working in terms of the system and government and governance. And so on. I met when I was in something called Folkehøyskole, this one-year college that we have here in Scandinavia, immediately following high school, and it's voluntary, but quite a lot of young Norwegians enter into Folkehøyskole. I had the pleasure of having three Nigerians in that school as students alongside myself and the others that were mostly Norwegian, and it was a very interesting kind of first experience of meeting, of course, real Africans, but certainly and also them being Nigerian. And I noticed that they were different from me, and I'm from Hamar, Fratbygding, and there was a different kind of mentality and a certain vibrancy in how they behaved and how they were that fascinated me a lot. And then just a couple of years ago, I read the book. I think you mentioned the author's name. I forget her name now, but exactly, Americana, right? Which actually, the book itself, I didn't leave the biggest mark on me. I found it a bit tedious, but her description of life in Nigeria was truly fascinating. And again, what struck me was this incredible youthfulness and vibrancy of life, of the culture, and particularly what it's like to be a young person in that country. And which brings me perhaps to my first main point, and that is Nigeria, as well as most other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, are going through a demographic revolution. You mentioned the population growth that is underway and what's projected. And I heard a statistic recently that by, I think it was 2030, every other child born on this planet will be born in Africa. It might have been every third, but anyways, it's an astonishing figure in terms of the rapid population growth and the high fertility rates in Africa. And we're very used to thinking of this as a problem. And of course, there are problems with rapid population growth. There are issues with that we all know about. But there's also a tremendous potential upside. And the reality is that you cannot understand the emergence of affluence in the Western world or in a place like China without factoring in population growth and demographic, a youth bulge, a demographic dividend that actually fueled the economic miracles that took place. It wasn't only about that, it was also about having, yes, the right policies, a minimum level of good governance, institutions that worked, and of course other factors. But the energy propelling forward that you get from having a huge young population is enormous if some of these other factors are also in place. So that's why when you look to the future for Nigeria, and when you look to the future for sub-Saharan Africa, there's a huge opportunity in the coming decades if one gets some of these things right. But that's a big if, right? And that's precisely what one needs to try to focus on. I think when you look at, for instance, the Africa 2063 framework that the African Union has committed to, all African countries have committed to, they've tried to factor this in, and there is a much stronger emphasis than before on investing in people, investing in education, and making sure that one puts in place the kinds of policies in the economic realm, the social realm, that can allow that youth bulge and that demographic dividend to actually be realized. Now, you also highlighted the problem of extreme inequality, and of course, again, if you look at different parts of the world in a historical perspective, there's no doubt that extreme inequality has been one of the real destructive forces for realizing the kind of economic forward momentum that we can get from a demographic transition, and also very often, unfortunately, leads to violence, leads to chaos, leads to wars and disaster. And in some ways, it seems to me that, again, looking at it from a distance, that Nigeria, in particular in Africa, is at this kind of very interesting but also kind of scary crossroads. It can kind of tip in this direction or in that direction, depending on what happens going forward. So it's sobering also what we just heard described, because I agree that one perhaps has to put more hope right now in the ability of more kind of bottom-up entrepreneurship and use of technology, use of connectivity and innovation to actually drive a progress in a country like Nigeria. But if everything else continues to not work in terms of the, as you called it, the system, in terms of government governance and so on, public institutions, it's hard to see it actually being enough to solve things, and certainly if extreme inequality goes unaddressed, there are big reasons to be very worried. And I thought it was interesting that Camilla, in her introduction here today, talked about how the city of Oslo has kind of become, although we are very much in the periphery of the world, become a microcosmos of the world, because of the fact that we have very large or growing populations of people from other parts of the world. And with connectivity, there is so much more that one can do across borders to bring about opportunities, to bring about change. So we're no longer living in a world where the only thing that can possibly happen between a country like Norway and a country like Nigeria has to happen through official development assistance and government-to-government cooperation. But those things are still very important and can be very important enablers. But in this day and age, so much more can be realized in terms of solving problems together, even if we live in very distant locations, simply through the fact that we're connected, and there are tremendous ideas in the various diasporas that can directly benefit the home country, and also, of course, vice versa. But I now work, as Nicola said, I work for EAT. We're dedicated to food and to transforming the food system to deliver better for people and planet. And so I want to talk a little bit about that issue, because it seems to also to be one of the critical challenges that Nigeria is faced with. Jens Petter, you mentioned to me in passing that 40% of the arable land in Nigeria is out of production.
60%.
60%.
Out of production, 40% actually.
Okay, 60% out of production. Of course, that has to do with our oil curves as well. That you haven't had, governments that are come and gone haven't been able to, or willing to, or whatever, put in place conditions that can make it profitable to cultivate the land and make a living from cultivating the land. Now, Nigeria is probably also a case, a kind of star example of a country that is faced with this triple challenge that we like to pinpoint from each perspective. That it's you have continuing in certain parts of the country, fueled in large part by the dysfunction factor. On the other hand, you go to the big cities, and I think it's true in Nigeria as in other parts of Africa. You see growing rates of obesity and of diabetes, of non-communicable diseases, directly linked to the fact that people are more and more eating junk food, getting more and more empty calories, because of the trends we see in the food system that brings more and more, that makes more and more of these bad foods more and more easily available. It's more affordable than the healthier alternatives that one has traditionally relied on. And then add to that you have an agricultural system that also delivers terrible outcomes in terms of environmental degradation. So it's this kind of triple burden of a system that is out of whack. And given now what we see in terms of growing conflict, you described it in the middle belt as well as in the north, if one isn't able to somehow, and I'm not sure how one can do this, or how Nigeria might address this, but if you're not able to somehow start addressing these challenges that have to do with agriculture and land, it's going to be even more difficult in the future. So I think all these problems are interlinked. But to end, there's a lot of hope in what has already been described as kind of the vibrancy of the bottom up of a society that survives day by day against the odds, not only survives but even finds way to thrive, and how can one kind of stimulate that even more while also trying to work at the other end to try to find ways to improve also the way the overall system functions. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Come on.
Thank you very much. I know we have loads of questions to ask, but I'm very quickly still going to focus on the panel we have here. And I know Svein Harald has been making copious notes, and Ambassador Shempru, you probably have some comments. So let's just say 2 minutes for a quick comment on what the other members of the panel have said. First from Ambassador Shempru, and then, or perhaps Ambassador Shempru, you should be the pivot here. So first from Svein Harald, and then perhaps from Olaf, then Ambassador Shempru, you take everything, and then we close, right? Oh, sorry, we won't close, but we'll just take a quick break for coffee and tea, and then we come back with the questions and the discussions. What do you think about that? Right, so that way. So first of all, comments from Svein Harald, and then additional comments from Olaf, and then Ambassador Shempru, you make a summary on it because I believe you sit in the central position, and then we take a quick break. Right. No, Etta di commentare. Okay, please, Svein Harald.
Yeah, because I'll use the privilege I have to just repeat myself. So the only way to create economic development is that create a situation where every individual in his or her daily work creates an economic surplus. That basically that they produce more than they eat themselves. That basically there's more to share with others, which of course links to the economic concept of called productivity. We basically, for every hour put in, you generate more food, more shoes, whatever you want to produce. If you have that, of course you get a wealth, you get a market functioning, and you get a tax base that allows the government to put taxes so that it can earn a revenue that it can use for education and health and so on. To do that, you need companies, you need businesses that can prosper and organize this into economic structure. For those to prosper, they need energy. So if there's no power, you cannot have a machine. And if you can't have a machine, you can't have a cash teller, and you can't have anything. So basically, energy is the most important enabler. And my favorite example, if you buy a barrel of oil, which you normally won't do, but it has as much energy as your physical work for the rest of your life. So it's just immense amount of energy that can be released by these processes. And I think the hope for Africa is that the energy revolution that we will see with solar in particular, which is now the cheapest mode of new energy in Africa. It has a cost which is half of the current power cost in Nigeria. So you just need to get that massively rolled out. And I think if I was in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I would just say, let's just make as many solar investment funds as we can and just get this thing out there, because that will create a surplus that can create a problem, that can create productivity, that can create. And then of course, when you have that, you can get communication, you get technology, you can have microfinance, and you get a tax base. So Nigeria, my prediction is that it will see a revolution from below, and an economic revolution, where basically when these things really start to work in a country with such entrepreneurialism, it will just blow away the politicians, because all these fools on the top will basically lose their position, because you just get this enormous momentum from below. And Nigeria is an extreme case in Africa, but I think it will start there, and then it will just spread across the entire continent, and we just will see prosperity.
That's so easy. I don't know.
Yeah, I honestly, I'm not sure exactly what to say right now. I think in many ways, to a large extent, I agree with what you were just saying. And, you know, I also share that optimism about the future. That what we're talking about here is not just kind of some crazy pipe dream because we desperately want to be optimistic. It's something about the forces at play that are changing the world as we speak. It's amazing, to travel around in Africa these days and see that so much business is happening and in so many ways one is already ahead in terms of how one has made use of the mobile revolution to facilitate the making of business to a much larger extent than some very so-called developed countries. And I agree that solar certainly holds the power, no pun intended, to do for energy, but then much beyond energy, what mobile has done in terms of communications and connectivity. And we have to force ourselves to not think in kind of linear ways and static ways, where we just kind of project the present into the future. There's so many opportunities for entrepreneurial revolutions going forward that can have enormous benefits and enormous ripple effects in a country like Nigeria and across Africa. And I do believe, for instance, that in the area of food there is a particularly large opportunity, especially when you look at what some of the traditional African food crops that are kind of gone out of fashion because everyone has kind of turned to corn and rice and Kentucky Fried Chicken and so on. But with new technology that can be distributed in new ways, and with a reliance on distributed decentralized energy, you can see the contours of also a food revolution in a continent like Africa. But we're not there yet, and it's gonna take effort. It's gonna take vision. It's not gonna happen by itself.
I mean, you heard what I said, and I agree. Nigeria works. You say it doesn't work. It's falling apart.
Yeah.
But it works.
No, I agree with him.
Let's do a vote there.
It works. And it works because the political class have a common aim of continue situation as it is.
Yes.
And solar power, renewables, it's an obvious answer. But what the political class does, because they benefit from the current situation, they put a tax on 20% on solar power equipment, which kills the solar power industry in Nigeria. So you have to get through that common interest of the political class of keeping the situation as it is. And how to do that, I think is the key. I think energy, and we are doing a lot to focus on energy. I mean, that's where the problem is. Because you can't have manufacturing, you can't process. I mean, even if you start growing agricultural products, you might start exporting some of the products. You might at least feed your own population. But to have the added value, you need to do the processing of the food.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can't do that without power.
Yeah.
You can't do it on a generator based. So energy is the key. But to break that, you have to break down the interest of the political class as it is. How to do that I think is the key. I talked to the head of the Anti-Corruption Bureau, EFCC. I presented some observations of the situation in Nigeria. It was not particularly interested in what we could do in assisting. But when I said this, I mean the energy is the key, and you have to resolve that. He said, yes, I agree, but he can't do it because it's too. The political class is so deeply involved in this gap. I mean the stolen oil, the undeclared refined products coming in. Nigeria is the biggest importer of generators in the world. Who is benefiting? It's this political class.
Yes.
So you have to break that. How to break that? Then you come. If you can manage to break that, you come into building the energy sector, developing the agricultural sector. It could be the food basket for the whole of West Africa. The potential is there, but how to get there? I think that's what I see. We have to discuss. I think decentralization politically could be dangerous. It's going to be the big issue in the next elections in 2019. You could see development of mini grids and so on because the whole infrastructure on the energy is breaking down. Lagos is going its own way, building its own energy cut off from the national grid. You might see that being a sort of decentralization along economic development models. But I agree, I mean, this is where we need to go to, but how to get there is the big question. And that's where the voters and the Nigerians abroad, good ideas, the trade union movement, I mean, who could push it? For me, that's a big question. Who could push the change?
All right, thank you. So we'll very quickly take a quick break. Please note that time is not on our side, so just enough time. Maybe you can get your coffee and then please just come back. So if we can resume 20:30, that would be perfect.
Okay, pause on.
There are many issues to discuss. Olaf, you have pointed to the importance of an agricultural revolution, the importance of looking at ways of getting the agricultural sector working. But significantly, you've also pointed to the importance of good institutions because change does not happen by itself. Svein Harald, you've talked about duality, the importance of duality, that is the reality of duality in the Nigerian situation, how at the top level things don't seem to be working, but at the bottom level there is a lot of vibrancy. And you've also taken the step forward as to point to a solution as enabling the dynamism that is present at the bottom level through technology, through innovations, the key of which is energy, distributed energy, which can basically create that bottom-up revolution. But of course, I must note that to balance it off, Olaf has cautioned that while that is a good idea, it does not work by itself. So in the absence of the other things, good institutions, a good enabling environment, such a revolution can be dangerous because you can't control it. Ambassador Shemprud, you have pointed out the importance of Nigeria, of course, noting the positive aspects, but you've also pointed out how important inequality is, which is one of the key things that is bedeviling Nigeria now. That's the critical problem. The rich are extremely rich and they are strangulating the economy in a sense. And the importance of improving the tax base. And you have also pointed out that a major challenge, if I understand you, because I don't want to put words in your mouth, you've pointed out that a major challenge is finding out how to go beyond a political class that seems to be strangulating, well, positive initiatives taking place in the economy. I'll put it in a very soft sense. But that was my summary, but I know we have very many other perceptions and very many other comments to make to what has been said. So I'm very quickly going to ask for a show of hands. Who are those that wish to make questions? Or no. These are going to be the caveat. Number one, not a comment, it has to be a question. And you have to make everything, you have exactly 30 seconds, right? Otherwise, I will switch off the mic and I'll take it from you. So I'm just going to count 5 people, and once we go through the 5 people, you ask your question. These are the rules. 5 people, 30 seconds each. You ask your question, we pause there, and then the panel will take through the questions. And if we have enough time, we take another 5, right? So the first 5, let's say something. Is one of you going to speak? Which of you?
Both. Both.
Please,
It's
one
different.
of you.
Different.
Like
It's
you're
different
together.
questions.
It's different
You have a
question.
Personal
Different-
question.
Okay, I'll take you first since you registered first. Mr. Mandel, do you have a question?
I think it'd be wrong to say that we're only allowed to have questions. I object to the rules.
No, because
Yeah.
Mr. Mandel, we have already had extremely good interventions here, so we don't want a further intervention at this point. We just need to work on what they have said. So you,
But-
my brother, you.
What about to give 30%, 30 seconds to use whatever the comment or question?
No,
Just
please.
30 seconds.
Please, just a question. Let's address what he has said. You, sir, in the car. You, sir. That is 3. Mr. Oparaibo, that is 4. And do we have, just a second, did I see a hand in the corner there?
A lady. A lady.
Okay.
Yes.
So, sir, you come first, sir. Then the gentleman with the cap at the back. And then there was somebody I saw on this side. No, Mr. Oparaibo, sorry. Mr. Oparaibo, and over to you, madam, at the end. Thank you. Please, just 30 seconds.
Yeah. First of all, my name is Samuel George Udo Archer. I'm from the eastern part of Nigeria. So my question goes to you directly, Your Excellency, the Ambassador of Norway, Nigeria. It's about since you're doing a sort of, we are trying to do some diagnosis on problems, attached to Nigeria as a country. And after all said and done, I still feel that there's one crucial aspect that is missing in action. And it goes on this. You as an ambassador, because I remember, in fact, first and foremost, I have to say that I represent a movement called the Indigenous People of Biafra here in Norway, or Oslo chapter. And we've made some contacts with the Norwegian government, with regards to the present agitation going on in the country. And from all your analysis and your presentations regarding the problems attached to Nigeria as a country, you've mentioned the problems attached to the those we call herdsmen operating within the Middle Belt region. And from our own point of view, even though the government of the country tried to attach it to farmers' clashes, we see some elements of ethnic cleansing going on. And because there are some sort of land grabs, attached to that. They occupy a territory, they take over it. And the present government is not doing anything to curtail such problems. My question goes to you. Please, are you aware that there is a crucial agitation that goes into the heart of the coexistence of that country of Nigeria as a country? Even as we are talking now, there will be a massive, what we call lockdown in the whole southeastern, region. Tomorrow, Friday. Please, I would like you to elucidate a little bit on this issue. Are you aware that we have a serious agitation going on now from the indigenous people of Biafra.
Thank you very much. Sir. Sorry, you need to.
First of all, I will introduce myself. I am Aham Azom. I've been living in Norway for decades. So before I put my question to you, I will commend three of you, and especially His Excellency Shefsu. So your presentation is wonderful. It's a pure X-ray of Nigerian situation. So thank you very much. Well, here comes my question. Here in Norway, we have many Nigerians who have been living here for many, many years, down to 1970 till today. And they have studied in Norway, they have adapted in Norway. So if they have their families here, and they're still in Norway today. And His Excellency pointed out that in Nigeria, you have a lot of Norwegian companies working there, also for many years. I will point out clearly and make it crystal clear that no Nigerian here in Norway has been recruited or have been employed through Norwegian company. Why? It's a simple question, please. We're here, we want to get back home. What is Norway doing? What are these companies doing to get recruitment of these people from Nigeria living in Norway for decades? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I believe, was it Mr. Parago?
I can speak without it. I very much commend the three speakers, the panel. It was wonderful. Made a good representation of the situation in Nigeria. My question will go to the ambassador, who has made a very nice, fantastic PR for the country, Nigeria. My own is more of I was happy when I saw the topic more than stockfish and gas. So my question goes to the area and the consular, is more of consular issue. Right now, that is a common knowledge that applicants, visa applicants in Nigeria coming to Norway, they have a waiting period of 18 months before they will get yes or no response to the application. So I'm wondering, Your Excellency, if this is, if it's not long and too much time. And the second part of the question is, within this waiting period of 18 months, the passports of the applicants are withheld by the embassy. So I'm wondering if this is proper. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Was there somebody
else here?
Yes, it was you. Sorry.
I think I can speak with you.
So that the others can hear you very well.
Yes, my name is Toby. And my question is on population explosion in Nigeria, the implications. Even though we've been optimistic all the presentations, but we know that there's a limit to growth, and if we talk about Marx's theory, even though it can be very obsolete, but the demographic of population growth in Nigeria, you discover that most of the poor and the uneducated, that's where you find a lot of population explosion among them. And this can be a problem. So my question generally to the panel is, what can one do to elevate the consciousness, to educate the people, because it is not enough to have high population if the population is not productive and well educated. And also population of women and education of women. We know that from economics, when women are educated, in fact, the education of a woman elevates a country more than even education of men. Because when a woman is educated, it can have a ripple effect on the family.
Yeah.
So, talking about Nigerians' political and religious differences, we know that there are some religious and cultural implications. There are people who believe that having many children, if you are poor, maybe one of your children may be rich in the future. And what happens is that most of these kids are not educated. Most of them now resort to crimes, and they can be easily recruited by some of these politicians. So what is the embassy especially doing to raise the consciousness about this negative impact of unmanaged population explosion in the country?
Good evening, everybody. I'm very, very pleased to be here today to meet you people. I'm very happy, really. We love you people. Biafrans love you people. Yes, I'm a Biafran. Please, my question is, as a woman, and there have been problems in Nigeria between the Christians and Muslims, Biafrans and the Nigerians. And Norwegians know all those problems. You people are saying about samarbete, cooperation. Without peace, there will be no cooperation. Because the East, we are the intellectuals, together with the Westerners. We are the people owning the oil. We are the people that eat the stockfish. We have the natural resources. And they are killing us, and they are eliminating us, and they are intimidating us. What is your role as an ambassador to our own side, the Biafrans? Whereas Norwegians, without you people, they would have finished us during the war. And we are very, very grateful about it. So what is your role now? Our children, they are dying. Women, they put the women in prisons last 2 weeks. The whole world heard about it. And myself being a woman, I'm not happy about it. What are you people doing about all these problems happening here in my own state? Thank you so much.
Perhaps can start Ola, if you want to go, or Svenha.
Anyone want to start the difficult issues? No, I think let me start with the most difficult questions, and I think they should be asked. They're not easy to answer. You remember the Areva youth started attacking Igbos in the north last autumn.
Yeah.
Very strong agitation as a response to the, in a sense, response to the demand for Biafra independence. What I saw was a very good reaction from politicians. Maybe the president was not in the forefront, but you had the Sultan of Sokoto who said, anyone want to attack an Igbo, he has to go through me first. Which set an example for the rest of the people, which killed off the Areva Youth Initiative, wherever that came from. But it was a very good response to what happened. And I do believe, and I've been discussing with Gina here, who is very knowledgeable about religion in Nigeria. I believe religious leaders can play a very important role on both sides, Christians, Muslims. They have a very important role to quell setting people against each other. I think it's extremely important. You say that there's a lot of agitation going on. There's also economic aspects to it. I mean, if you look at the economic situation and the activities now, companies moving from Honor to Lagos, I mean, there's an economic, very challenging economic situation which needs to be maintained with the economic diversity of the country. But I think religious leaders has an important role. I think it's going to be extremely, as you said, important and difficult now in the time leading up to the elections, because as I said initially, it's identity politics which rules the day. So, but then you have the discussion about the next president should come from Southeast, if you allow me to use that expression. No, it's a discussion. It's a discussion. Because Igbos have not been deemed to be qualified to be a president. Obasanjo came out and said next time anyone should be a president, because it hasn't been. So I mean, it's getting to be put on the agenda. But I think you also have to focus on the economic and political ideas and the election campaign. On the other, I think on Nigerians recruited to Norwegian companies, there are examples. I mean, in Equinor, there's and Osman knows a number of Nigerians working for Norwegian companies. But there are examples. But of course, I think it's a good initiative to try to more. I know Nigerians working for Aker Solutions. I know Nigerians working for Equinor. There's a number of Nigerians working for Norwegian companies. But more could be done. Definitely more could be done. And then on visa applicants, I think
those people working there, are they indigenous of Nigeria? Are they recruited from Norway to Nigeria?
Among Nigerians in Norway, yes, recruited to Norwegian companies. On the visa applicants, I think there might be cases where there's a long time. But I think, Osman, I could consult with you. I think it usually it's done for business people in 2 weeks.
Yeah, no more than 2 weeks.
No more than 2 weeks.
It's 7 days, so in processing time, and we
So
had about 100 processes, 100 Nigerian people going to Norway for training, and we always had a visa.
So basically,
in Schengen.
Sorry, I think what he was referring to is the family
reunification.
And visits.
And private family visits, I guess. Yes. It takes a while. It's decided in UDI. It takes quite a while. Population issues. What we do, I think, again, when it comes to the population growth and the demographic challenges, it's complicated. It's very sensitive to discuss it. I discuss it openly with religious leaders. The answer is most of the time, I mean, education, and in particular education of young girls is the answer. It's a long-term solution, but it changes the realities. Secondly, we, as Norway, we support strongly UNFPA and UN Women on education of women, and UNICEF education of young girls. But we have a strong program basically targeted on the demographic challenge. But then you have to, I mean, the opportunities is there if you have the number of, I mean, the big part of the population is in the age where you actually work. And it could be really beneficial to Nigeria, having such a young workforce. But it needs to be educated, and you need to give them jobs.
I will start.
Yep.
I will talk about what you call. I cannot comment on the regional aspects because I have no knowledge. But I will start by I heard the other day a nice story of another country which we all consider to be a poor country for long, namely Bangladesh. Because many of us think about Bangladesh as one of the poorest countries in the world. What happened there, of course, was an immense industrialization. So basically, all our clothes now are made in Bangladesh. Yeah. So what happened? Someone moved there, put up a plant, and then that was copied by everyone else. So now I think there's $32 billion value creation in the garment industry, which has created jobs for the women. So they get away from the men, so to say. They get free, and they get their own salaries, right? And because they get their own salaries, they can decide over themselves. And they move away from the villages. They move, sorry to say again, they move into the cities, and they prosper. And they get employment, they get predictability, they know they will get pension, and they have a surplus. And they're not anymore under the command of their husband. So what's happened to the fertility rate? It has dropped. So it's 2.1. It basically means that Bangladesh, which is one of the most populated countries in the world, the problem is solved. Sort of when the kids of today's women grow up, there won't be more people. And why is it solved? Well, because it's economic development, because it's firm, because there's power. And it's not dark, so they can go to work instead of being at home in the dark. So then you can compare Botswana, which is one of the countries I mentioned. I checked the numbers while he was talking. So good, he got all these difficult questions. So in Botswana, it's Bangladesh 2.1, Botswana 2.7, Ghana 4.12 kids per woman, and in Nigeria 5.6. And why is that? Well, I will claim it's because the economic development hasn't happened. So let's make economic development happen, which is one of the main, I think, learnings. Everyone who hasn't seen those movies should see the videos on YouTube by Professor Hans Rosling. Yes. He's the most inspiring, and all the crap which is out on the internet, this is the one thing to watch, right? How, as countries mature, as they develop, as the GDP grows, how that translates into the fertility rates, and how that basically stabilizes employment. Sorry, stabilizes the population. So he basically called off the sort of population crisis of the world, simply because he said with economic development, as we just discussed, you will basically have a much more satisfactory development. So just go out and make it happen.
In Nigeria, huh?
Yes, I'm again sitting here thinking how to compete with these guys. In terms of, I don't think too much to add specifically to the comments to these particular questions, and I very much agree with this notion that if you have the conditions in place that allow that kind of entrepreneurial spirit to be tapped, but like we've seen in Bangladesh, a lot of good things tend to flow from that. But of course, it's also the fact that you in Bangladesh at that time you had an enormous human resource base that could be mobilized, which also is part of the explanation of how that, if you can call it economic miracle, I'm not sure, but certainly a very important and very impressive transition, how that could happen. So it gives kind of hope to a lot of countries, and not least in a continent like Africa, that that's possible. I do think, I mean, you touched upon the importance of faith leaders and the faiths in dealing with the kinds of tensions and the kinds of conflicts and the kinds of challenges that one faces in a particular country, and I very much agree with that. And I also think we should expect when you look at the situation in a country like Nigeria, but not only there, certainly in many countries around the world, including, for instance, the United States, that the kind of the carriers of the values and kind of the moral ethical traditions that have contributed to shaping a particular country, particular history, particular culture, that those institutions would have a perhaps more visible sometimes and more daring and challenging role to play in terms of rising up and protesting against the dysfunctions that we have when you have a political class that is basically stealing from the people. In this case, but in other countries you have other abuses that sometimes you don't see a particularly strong stand against from the faith institutions that have plenty of ammunition and plenty of reasons to speak out because it goes against the fundamentals of these faiths. And it happened, of course, in many countries that the faith institutions have stood up, have spoken up, and have led in many ways a charge to deal with problems of oppression, of governments abusing their power, of committing major crimes. And what I think we should try to bring about is a reflection across faiths, not perhaps so much, okay, how can we all come together and hold hands and sing Kumbaya, but rather, when we look at ourselves and look at our own tradition, what is going on in our midst and what is going on in our country that we have a duty to speak up against. And if one dares to do that more strongly, more often, there's a greater chance of creating the kinds of pressures on people in power to behave differently. I think we've seen that in our own history in Norway. We've seen it, of course, in South Africa. We've seen it in periods in the United States. Perhaps not seeing it enough right now. I think the more of that, the better. The greater the chances of actually breaking through this logjam of dysfunction and abuse and get to a different point.
Very good. Very good. So very quickly, just to close, just one final
between the message of Jesus and the Christian evangelists who came along with colonialism. So the moment you say Christian in Gambia, they'll say for people up country who have not experienced Christians before, they'll say it's the same as colonialism. And this needs to be addressed. Jesus' teaching is not about colonialism, but the British and all the others used, amongst others, religion to mobilize their own people for their own interests. We have to distinguish these issues. That's why the leader of Sokoto was able to say, if you want to attack anyone, you'll have to come through me, because it's against the teaching of his religion. So, but perhaps by being here in Norway, having contact with some Muslims, this might help you to help your own community back in Nigeria. We cannot afford to be pessimists. We are Africa. Africa is us. So, my other point is environmental change also brings insecurity between pastoralists and agriculturalists in the face of climate change. These are discrete issues which the ordinary person cannot see for himself. We who are here, we are getting a lot of education socially,
and are able to distinguish between these issues. In the Lake Chad area, it's the same conflict. In Mali, it's the same conflict. In between Senegal and Mauritania, it's the same conflict. So my appeal again is that let us try to see ourselves as change agents for humankind. It is not easy. No good things are easily achieved. None whatsoever. Not even our monthly salaries. Because if it's minus 25 degrees, we have to go out to work. Yeah, it's a fact of life. So this is my appeal to you, my brothers and sisters, especially, that we show that we can be patient, we can be disciplined in the face of very difficult issues. Thank you very much for your participation and for coming, and thank you, gentlemen, for your very good presentation.
So, thank you. I have the task of being the flower girl here and say thank you. And thank you. And thank you so much for coming. And thank you to all of you for coming. Before you leave, I just want to say two things. And one is that please come back to this house. Because I think, you know, we are a small enterprise, but with a big possibility of doing something good. And we have a heartbeat in this house, and that is every Thursday. And we meet to eat together at 5:30. And if you want to join us for that meal, please send us an SMS or a message and come and join us. Because we are all searching for how we can make a difference in this world. So that's Thursdays, 5:30 supper. Then tomorrow in this house, 7 o'clock, we will have a movie night. And both movies are from Nigeria, made in Nigeria. And one is what Keba also referred to. It's a documentary about the imam and the pastor that were here some years ago.
Yeah, very good.
So it's a very good film, and they are great people.
I've used it in my school here in Oslo.
Yeah?
Yeah.
And the other movie was made in 1956. And the film was credited by contemporary sources as being the first feature-length color film written and played by Africans from all over the continent. But it was film shot in Nigeria. It was a IFC MRA production. It's worthwhile seeing. It's about freedom. It's called Freedom, and it is about what would you call it? It's not a real African country, but it's a kind of a fantasy African country, but it's shot in Nigeria, and it's about a country on the bridge of getting its freedom or liberty. Shot in '56, and it's been shown all over Africa for years, and it was in Hollywood and around the world too. It's worthwhile seeing just for the flavor of it. It's a good movie.
When is that?
So that's 7 o'clock tomorrow, and we will serve popcorn.